Good morning. The irony of opening a women's conference with a man is not lost on me. I want to have you look around the room, spot the most paranoid person that you know in this room, and then I want you to point at that person for me. Okay, don't actually do it. But as an organizational psychologist, when I walk into workplaces, I see paranoia everywhere. And I want to ask what we can do to turn that upside down. What I really want to know is, what does it take to own a face that looks like this? Now, as I started studying people's success in the workplace, there were three things that really mattered: hard work, talent, luck. But then there was a fourth factor that most of us overlooked, which is the way that we interact with other people. And I found across the world's cultures, in every industry that's been studied, there are these three fundamental styles of interaction that show up again and again. On one end of the spectrum, we have people that I've come to call takers. Takers are people who are always trying to come out ahead in every interaction. They will volunteer for interesting, visible, important projects, dump the grunt work on everybody else, and then walk away with the lion's share of credit for collective achievements, which is why we all love working with takers. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have givers. For me, a giver is more than a volunteer, more than a philanthropist. It's just someone who enjoys helping others and often does it with no strings attached. So if you're a giver, you might share your knowledge freely, you might step up to mentor junior people, you could just show up early or stay late to support those around you. Now, many of us love the idea of being givers, but we also know there are takers out there. So what a lot of us do is we say, I'm going to reserve giving for my family, my friends, maybe a few trusted colleagues. And then in the rest of my relationships, I'll choose a third style called matching. If you're a matcher, you try to keep an even balance of give and take, quid pro quo. I'll do something for you if you do something for me. That seems like a pretty safe way to live your life. My question was, is that the most productive and effective way to live your life? And the definitive answer was, maybe. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you to think about the success of givers and takers and matchers. Who does the best? Who does the worst professionally? But before that, I want to give you a chance to think about your own style. We all have moments of giving, taking, and matching. Your style is just how you treat most of the people most of the time, your default approach to interactions. So I prepared a short test that you can take to figure out if you are more of a giver, a taker, or a matcher, and I'd like you to take it now. This is the only thing I will say this morning that has no data behind it, but I am convinced the longer it takes you to laugh at this cartoon, the more worried we should be that you are a taker. Now, I like this cartoon because it reminds us that narcissists are one kind of taker, people with fragile, inflated egos who think if I want to win, everyone else has to lose. But there's another kind of taker that's more common. It's someone who used to be a giver or a matcher and then got burned one too many times and learned the hard way that it can be dangerous to be generous. So a lot of takers don't mean to be cruel or cutthroat. They just say, look, the world is a dog-eat-dog competitive place. If I don't put myself first, no one else will. There is a third kind of taker we won't be addressing today, and that is called a psychopath. But the other two kinds of takers, we can change their styles. And we might get to that a little later. But I was curious, what does it mean to be a giver, taker, or matcher for your success? And the data were really clear from three different kinds of jobs. We had engineers, where we track your productivity based on the number of favors you do for your colleagues versus the number of favors you receive in return. We had medical students, where we measured their grades based on how much they enjoyed helping others. And then my personal favorite, salespeople. And in sales, we wanted to know what happens to your revenue based on how hard you work to serve your clients and your colleagues above your job description. Now, these are three very different ways of measuring success in three very different kinds of jobs, but the same group among the givers, takers, and matchers performed the worst in each of them. I'd love to get a vote on who you think that is. So can you raise your hand, please, if you think the worst performers were the takers? Show of hands for the takers being the worst performers. Raise them high so we know who the optimists are in the room. All right, Now, how many think the matchers were the worst performers? Raise your hands, please. It is exhausting to keep score of every interaction, true. And then how many think the givers are the worst performers? That looks like a majority, and the majority is right. The givers are the worst performers in each of these jobs. The engineers who have the lowest productivity and the highest error rates are the ones who do more favors than they get back. They're so busy doing other people's jobs, they literally run out of time and energy to get their own stuff done. In medical school, the students with the lowest grades are the ones who agree most strongly with statements like, "I love helping others," which suggests the doctor you ought to trust is the one who came to med school with no desire to help anybody. And then in sales, too, the lowest revenue accrued to the most generous salespeople. I used to work in sales. I found this a little puzzling. So I went through all our data sets, and I found one person with the highest giver score in his company and the lowest revenue. And I asked him, how do you explain this? Why do you suck at your job? I didn't ask it that way. But what's the cost of generosity in sales? And he said, well, if I could be totally candid with you, I just care so deeply about my customers that I would never sell them one of our crappy products. This is sad news for givers. How many of you believe that you're more of a giver than a taker or a matcher? Okay, it would have been more before we talked about this evidence. But this unfortunately happens to givers all the time. An example that I've found to be really fascinating is Kat Cole. Kat was the first person in her family to make it to college after being raised by a single mother who had to work 3 jobs just to be able to create a food budget of $10 a week. And Kat has to carry 2 jobs of her own all through high school. She serves at a restaurant, she sells clothes at a mall. And Kat's the kind of giver who always likes to help and never asks for anything in return. So one day in her restaurant, the cook doesn't show up. And Kat is the one to race back into the kitchen and start cooking. Another day, a manager quits, and Kat takes it upon herself to organize the schedule so everyone can maintain their desired shift and the restaurant keeps smooth operations. And nobody really notices that this is happening. Kat doesn't get any credit or recognition for it. And this is the kind of situation that drives all of us crazy, right? We have a woman doing the lion's share of the helping and giving and getting nothing in return. And if the story ended there, it would be a little bit depressing. But then it takes a surprising twist and gets much worse. Because Kat is so dedicated to helping other people in her restaurant that she ends up failing all of her classes and having to drop out of college. And that's what happens to a lot of givers. They don't secure their oxygen masks before helping others. And this is more true for women than men. Women feel a tremendous sense of responsibility to help other people. They tend to do more of the giving than men do, and they are at greater risk for burnout because of it. Which led me to wonder, if givers are the worst performers, who are the best performers? Go back to the engineer's productivity, the medical student's grades, the salespeople's revenue. Who do you think comes out on top? Let's get another vote. How many think the best performers typically are the takers? Raise your hands. How many for the matchers? And how many of you didn't raise your hands? All right, thanks for participating this morning. Maybe you didn't raise your hand because you already anticipated what took me a decade to figure out. Let me start with the good news. The takers are not the best performers in most jobs. Takers tend to rise quickly, but they also fall quickly. And they fall at the hands of matchers. If you're a matcher, you believe in an eye for an eye, a just world. What goes around comes around. And when it doesn't, you know it's time to step up and become the karma police. Think about it. There is nothing a matcher hates more than seeing a taker act selfishly and get away with it. Right? That's just not fair. So if you're a true matcher, when you meet a taker, you feel like it's your mission in life to punish the hell out of that person. And that way justice is served. Well, some matchers will go out on a limb to do this. They deliberately feed takers false information to sabotage their success. More matchers, though, choose a more subtle deadly weapon, which is called gossip. It usually goes something like this. Don't trust this guy. He's a selfish bastard. And that makes it really hard for takers to sustain their success because most people are matchers. And that means if you're a taker, you can't exploit one person and then start over fresh in a new relationship. There's usually a matcher waiting in the wings to spread negative reputational information and protect everybody else against you. So the logical conclusion is it must be the matchers who are the best performers. But they're not. In every job, every organization, every industry I've studied in the last dozen years, the best results belong to the givers again. Givers are overrepresented on both extremes. Most of the bottom 25% of performers are givers, but so too are the top 25% of superstars, even though matching is the most common style. And I thought this was a fascinating paradox, that helping others could sink your career or it could accelerate it. And I wanted to understand the differences between failed givers and successful givers, to try to figure out, if you wanted to help others, how do you do that without sacrificing your own career? And there was a great insight in Kat Cole's story. So when Kat left off, she's failing all of her classes, she's dropping out of school. And at 19 years old, a manager comes up to her and says, we wonder if you want to expand our operations overseas and open our first restaurant in Australia. And Kat says, I'm not qualified. She has less experience and less education than every other candidate. But you know what? She gets the job because she's the only person who's worked every job in that restaurant. So she's sent to Australia, opens a restaurant there, does it on other continents too. At 26, she's put in charge of corporate training. And then at 32, she's named the CEO of a brand that some of you have heard of. 5 years later, under her leadership, it's worth over $1 billion. It's called Cinnabon. Now, you may be wondering, as I did, would a giver really sell gooey treats? When I asked Kat about this, she said, we're all going to eat this stuff occasionally. It might as well taste ridiculously good. But if you look at Kat's story, what you can see is that givers often fail in the short run but succeed in the long run. It does not happen overnight that she ended up getting all of these extra skills. But over time, givers learn more than takers and matchers, because the time you spend solving other people's problems actually gives you knowledge and skills to solve the organization's problems. It took a while for social capital to build too. Right? Over time, she accrued a reputation as a generous person who was looking out for the success of her team and the organization. But that didn't happen right away. And I want to know how we can all accelerate the success of givers. And how do we build workplaces where not only are people motivated to help, but when they do that, they get to rise too. I wanted to give you a top 10 list of the most important steps you can take to succeed as givers and support the givers around you. But sadly, I could only think of 3. So it's going to be a top 3 list. Are you ready? All right, I was going to do it anyway, but I appreciate the enthusiasm. The first thing that you need to do is think differently about giving. When Cheryl and I studied the differences between men and women when it comes to helping, we found that men were much more likely to be takers than women, but that men and women are equally likely to be givers. The gender differences were not in how much giving they did, but what kind of giving they did. Women got stuck with the majority of the office housework, the organizing schedules, the planning meetings, the taking notes, the creating parties, and these acts of giving are just not valued and rewarded in organizations, which is really unfair. We also found that women did the majority of the one-on-one problem solving and helping behind the scenes, which is more valuable but less visible. Meanwhile, men were more likely to do these acts of giving that added no value but everybody applauded, like responding to a 200-person email and sharing a 1-sentence piece of information. And men got more credit for that too, because people were like, well, I expect a woman to be caring and helpful, but I would have never in a million years expected a man to think of another human, so what a great guy. He deserves to succeed for this. So what do we do about this? Well, one thing we need to do is we need to redistribute the burden of these activities, right? We need men to step up and do the mentoring and the helping and the problem solving and the planning of parties and the taking notes. But we also need to make sure that all of our helping choices are aligned with either high impact or low cost. And this is the sad thing about a lot of givers. They say yes to all the people all the time with all the requests, as opposed to asking, where can I make the biggest contribution? And recognizing that every no is a chance to say yes where it matters most. So one thing we see successful givers do is say, I'm going to focus on giving in the few ways that align with my skills and my interests, so that I'm making a unique contribution, and so that giving is energizing rather than exhausting. The other thing we see successful givers do is ask themselves, how do I give in ways that are high value to others but low cost to me, so I don't overextend and self-sacrifice? And I picked up a great idea on this from the person who is named Fortune's Best Networker. Fortune magazine analyzed the entire LinkedIn database to to find out who's connected to more powerful people than anyone else. And I just want to show you a picture of the winner in this analysis. Here is Fortune's best networker. It's the guy, not the cat. His name is Adam Rifkin. If you didn't recognize him, neither did I. He violates everything I thought I knew about great networkers. He's a shy, quiet computer engineer in Silicon Valley who owns a few patents. He builds supercomputer applications for NASA. And as you might have guessed, he's addicted to a TV show called Star Trek. How did Adam become Fortune's best networker? To find out, I did what's only natural in a connected world, which is I started stalking him. And eventually what I learned is that Adam said, look, the key to balancing generosity and success, he was known as an extremely helpful person, is he said, you don't have to be Mother Teresa or Gandhi. All you have to do is more 5-minute favors. For Adam, a 5-minute favor is just a small way of adding large value to other people's lives. It's a micro loan of your time, your skills, or your connections. It's giving a quick piece of feedback. It's going out of your way to recognize somebody who's maybe been a giver but not gotten the credit that they deserve. It's making an introduction between two people who could benefit from knowing each other, but in fact have not been connected previously. And I think this 5-minute favor concept is so powerful because it's a reminder for givers that you do not have to spend 19 hours helping every person who asks. And if you know somebody who's more of a taker or a matcher, it's a great gateway drug. Right? Because everybody could afford to do a few more 5-minute favors each week. So if you can redefine acts of giving as not about saying yes, not about being nice, but about making a unique contribution and minimizing the cost to you, ironically, although you feel less altruistic, you actually give more. When we study this over time, we find that the people who make thoughtful choices about who, when, and why they help and how, they actually end up at lower burnout rates, and they ultimately end up giving more than people who are more selfless in their choices. Second thing that I've learned about successful givers is that you have to be careful about who you let onto your team and into your life, and who you interact with. And we see this especially in hiring. My favorite approach to hiring was invented by IKEA. The takers tend to take that a little too literally. But if you want to be a successful giver, everybody thinks what you want to do is surround yourself with successful givers. You want to have the right people on your bus. And that's actually not the most important thing to do. It's actually more critical to keep the wrong people off your bus. The negative impact of a taker on a culture is usually double to triple the positive impact of a giver. Think about it this way. One bad apple can spoil a barrel, but one good egg just does not make a dozen. I don't know what that means, but I hope you do. Now, think about it. You let even one taker into a team, and paranoia starts to spread. People are watching their backs, worrying that someone is out to get them. Whereas if you put one giver in a team, there's not this explosion of generosity. More often, people are like, great, that person can do all our work. And so choosing who you want to hire, who you want to collaborate with, is less about bringing in the givers and more about weeding out the takers. If you do that well, you're left with givers and matchers. The givers will be generous because they don't have to fear the consequences. And the beauty of matchers is that they follow the norm. In the presence of givers, matchers act like givers too, so you can shift the whole population of a group in the giving direction just by getting rid of the takers. How do you do that? How do you spot a taker before it's too late? My favorite question is looking at theft. So think about stealing from a company. That's one taking behavior. You could steal cash, intellectual property, materials, merchandise. The question is, what % of people in the United States do you think steal at least $10 from their company in a typical month? Get a quick vote on this. How many people think that it's 0 to 20% of people who steal at least $10 from their company in a month? Okay, 20 to 40%. 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 99. Anyone for 100? Okay, you realize that includes you, right? All right, look, I want you to take your results with a grain of salt. What is the actual theft rate? I have no idea. But I care a lot about what you think the theft rate is. Because the data show the higher your estimate that other people are thieves, the greater the chances that you are a thief. If you're sitting at a table with someone who had an 80% or higher estimate, I would check your wallet now. Now, what's interesting about this is there are lots of ways you could give a high estimate and not be a taker. Maybe it's your job to catch thieves. Maybe you worked with a lot of takers in the past. But the sad thing is that when people answer a question like this, they ask themselves, well, what would I do? Or what have I done? And then they project that onto others. So caricature, extreme taker answering this question. Let's see, what % of people steal $10 in a month? Takers always talk like that. Last week I stole $376, 10 a month has got to be common, 97%. Whereas an extreme giver answering the same question, how do you even steal $10 from a company? How many pens do you have to take home? It's about 70. But what kind of person would do such a thing? I don't know, 2%. Notice how the giver sounds exactly like me. But in large samples, these differences play out. Takers anticipate more selfish behavior from others, and that's how they justify and rationalize being a taker. It's not me. All of you people are selfish, and I am just being smart and cautious and self-protective. So if you ever want to catch a taker, think about a taking behavior that you are worried about and ask about how common somebody thinks it is. It could be stealing credit for other people's ideas. It could be hiding or hoarding knowledge instead of sharing it. And say, how common do you think those actions are? And then give them a chance to explain their estimate. And there are lots of answers that are just fine. The one to watch out for is when they say, you know, at the end of the day, I think people are fundamentally selfish. And what they don't realize is they're giving you a pretty good look in the mirror at them, right? Because other people are fundamentally selfish is code for I have become fundamentally selfish. So watch out for those takers. The last thing that's critical to being a successful giver is being willing to ask for help. Maybe this hits a little too close to home for some of you. But we see, especially with women, there's a strong sense that you want to be the giver in every single relationship. And what that means is you end up basically getting into a situation where no good deed goes unpunished. And what you want to do is make a distinction between taking and receiving and say, look, asking for help does not make me a taker. Taking is using somebody else. Receiving is about being willing to accept somebody else's generosity and then pay it back or pay it forward if the opportunity presents itself. And help seeking is critical, one, because every giver needs support. And two, because somewhere between 75 and 90% of all giving in organizations starts with a request. So we don't have a lot of people volunteering proactively and saying, I'm kind of bored this month, how could I enrich your life? Right? Most giving is in reaction to a request, but a lot of people don't ask. You want to be the giver, you don't want to burden others, you don't want to make yourself too vulnerable. And yet, if you never ask, we have a lot of frustrated givers around you who would love to be helpful and support you if only they knew what you needed and when. So asking for help is a critical skill for givers, but we need to go one step further. I think we need to create structures that allow people, especially women, to support each other. And my favorite example is called the Reciprocity Ring. All you do is you gather together. It's kind of like a lean-in circle. Everybody makes a request for something they want or need, but could not get on their own. And then everyone else tries to help them. And you see a whole range of requests. You see people say, I want to see a Bengal tiger in the wild. You see people say, I'm looking for babysitting help. You see people say, I'm looking for career advice. But my all-time favorite request happened in my classroom a few years ago. A student said, my dream is to work at Six Flags Amusement Park. But I don't think they recruit at the Wharton School of Business. So could anybody help get my foot into the door? Another student offers to help. 2 weeks later, I come to class and ask for an update. And Alex says, I just got off the phone with the CEO of Six Flags. And I'm like, this is the best thing that's ever happened in my classroom. Did he give you a job? Did he open other doors? And Alex says, you will not believe this. The guy was extremely generous. I learned a ton. And I now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I never want to work in this industry. This is a great exercise, though, because one, the givers ask. When everybody in a team or a group is making a request, it's not uncomfortable. Two, the takers give. We actually find that they triple their contributions during this exercise because they don't want to be outed as takers. And three, the matchers often walk away realizing that Matching is not the most efficient way to operate in every interaction. And if we are all givers in a network, then we can all get more help. Because instead of trading favors one by one, we can all go to the person who has the knowledge or the connections that we need. So look, I have a simple vision for the world of work. I want to create a world where people are willing to be givers. And when they do that, they do not have to fail because of it. And if we do that well, we will see paranoia flipped upside down into a state that's called pronoia. If you are pronoid, you carry the delusional belief that other people are plotting your well-being, going around behind your back and saying exceptionally nice things about you. And I think if people are going to live in fear in organizations, instead of being afraid that others are out to get them, it would be kind of nice if they feared that others were out to help them. That is the promise of a world with more successful givers. It's a world I hope you will help me create. Thank you.